Mo Hartley has been here at Old Salem Museums and Gardens for the last several years and has also been part of this whole process of re-examining North Carolina ceramic traditions, how they've evolved, and the communities for whom pottery making was so integral to identity, ethnicity, religion. We'll hear much more about these themes tomorrow. But while in this rediscovery, we've understood that there were other areas of North Carolina involved in ceramic production. However, it in no way takes away the centrality of the Moravian contribution to North Carolina and the people like Gottfried Aust, Rudolf Christ, and those who came after them as really the founders of pottery here in North Carolina. So with that, I'll introduce Mo Hartley, our Director of Archaeology, and he can share with you his discoveries about the pottery that was made here and the potters who produced it.
Mike, I think.
I want to move briskly, and so I will read this presentation. But as I'm going along, if someone wants to fire a question, please don't hesitate to do that, because I am able to stop. Archaeology in Wachovia has played a major role in our understanding of this place and of the Moravians as viewed through their use of this place. In Bethabara, while it could be seen in the maps drawn by the Moravian surveyor Christian Gottlieb Reuter and through the vast records kept by the Moravians, it only regained a living presence in the landscape with its revelation by archaeology, begun by Stanley South in the 1960s and carried further by others. Bethabara is now a touchstone, literally, of Moravian history and presence in North Carolina from the time of the beginnings of the Moravians here on the mid-18th century frontier. In the same way, archaeology has provided insights into Salem, without which much that we know, much that is presented and celebrated by Old Salem Museums and Gardens would remain unknown. And in the same way, much that we know about Bethania, about Friedland, about Friedberg and Hope would remain obscure and unclear. And so we turn to archaeology and pottery, pottery being a class of artifacts that has received huge interest, huge emphasis. Witness the Symposium. Pottery naturally emerges on historic archaeological sites. It's ubiquitous. Everyone uses it to one degree or another, and it is a well-known carrier of cultural information. Who made it and where? What materials did they make it with? How was it decorated? How was it used? What systems can be seen in the array of pottery present in a household, in a community, in a culture? What does it mean? Questions about pottery such as these have engaged archaeologists from the earliest days of the archaeological study of people and the lives they lived. Awareness of Moravian pottery extends deeply into our interest in Moravian culture and its presence in North Carolina. The Wachovia Historical Society, formed in the 19th century to collect and hold aspects of Moravian heritage and history, has been instrumental in preserving much evidence of the Moravian potter's craft. Tools from the potter's shops of Salem and Wachovia, including a potter's wheel, a glaze mill, potter's ribs, and other shaping tools, molds in which various pottery objects were formed, pipe presses, a potter's rolling pin, saggers, and other kiln furniture. John Bivens, who did so much work in the material things of Wachovia, tells us that these extant tools were given to the Salem potter Heinrich Schaffner by the Salem potter John Holland, who had in return received many of them from the Moravian potter Rudolf Christ, and so on. and that these tools were given to the Wachovia Historical Society around 1900 by Daniel Kraus, who was apprentice, then journeyman under Heinrich Schaffner, and who on Schaffner's death became the last master potter of Salem. And so as we follow the tools through time, we also follow the Moravian pottery tradition through time. A complicated story of individuals producing the wares that are important enough in our minds to bring us together today. Additionally, the Wachovia Historical Society acquired and protected many examples of the results of the potter's craft, from the most prosaic, say a flower pot, to the most dramatic, the Aust shop sign. The searching out and acquiring for the purposes of curation and preservation continues today by Old Salem Museums and Gardens and others. And so, yes, awareness of Moravian pottery extends deeply into our interest in the Moravians of North Carolina. And the extensive records kept by the theocratic leadership of Wachovia during the period of that pottery production, was a congregation business, document much of the operation of the Moravian pottery shops through time. But as John Bivens said in his, clearly pointed out in his 1972 book, The Moravian Potters in North Carolina, quote, "It was not until the excavations at Bethabara were begun that anyone became aware of the real significance of the tradition in which local potters were working. Under the sharp eye and careful hand of the archaeologist, broken pottery forms long buried in the earth were painstakingly pieced together," unquote. Bivens also said the interpretation of these finds has not been completed and will not be for many years because of the quantity and the complexity of the archaeological record, unquote. That statement from 1972 holds today. This symposium, for example, is a step along the way, not a concluding summary of a process of scholarship now completed, and much work remains to be done. The first step, the first trenches at Bethabara were, of course, cut by Stan South in 1963. Much of what Bivens was able to say in his 1972 book was directly derived from Stan South's work, as Bivens freely acknowledged. The work at Bethabara was supported by Ed Stockton of the Moravian Church, Salem scholars Frank Albright and Frank Horton, and had substantial financial undergirding from Charles Babcock. Stanley, assisted by Brad Rauschenberg, accomplished a broad monumental archaeological revelation of Bethabara. But of course, the emphasis here today, an emphasis is on pottery, an emphasis that was also present at the outset for Stanley. Stan South in Bethabara and later in Salem is recorded in a book, Historical Archaeology and Wachovia, excavating 18th century Bethabara and Moravian pottery, but it is important to recognize that it is in fact the publishing of this manuscript entitled Discovery in Wachovia, written between 1966 and 1972. John Bivens' publication of his book in 1972, which he acknowledged rested on the artifacts excavated by South, superseded the publication of South's book. 30 years later, in 1999, scholars and publishers recognized that this manuscript was a critical body of information, and the volume was published by Kluwer Academic Plenum Publishers of New York. Stanley's work in the 1960s was the genesis of scholarship grounded in archaeology and Moravian pottery. Bivens was a beneficiary of this work, and so are we all. The Moravian potter Gottfried Aust had arrived in Bethabara in 1755 and immediately began producing pottery in temporary quarters. At Bethabara, Stanley dug into Gottfried Aust's pottery shop, which that potter built in 1756 and worked until 1771, when he moved his shop to Salem, the new central town of Wachovia. South has said that when he opened the first trenches in 1963, the Aust pottery shop was of a particular target. In addition to cutting into the Aust pottery shop, it was hoped that locating this structure would lead to the further discovery of Aust waster dump nearby. 2 Aust waster dumps were identified by Stanley, and from this waster dump material, South has created a compendium of the wares, the products which Aust was producing at Bethabara. I'm conscious of the cautionary note that Mary Farrell gave us earlier, saying that if you looked at her waster dump, you would see a lot of weird stuff that never saw production. However, this is where we know what we know about about South's work and about his work into the Aust pottery shop. Stan South's archaeology and form analysis. Oh, let me back up. For this slide, and in terms of that bugaboo, provenance, the secure archaeological context of the compendium continues to provide a benchmark of Aust pottery today. And again, I appreciated Michelle Erickson's comments about how she knows what she knows about what she's doing from the archaeological record. Stan South's archaeology and form analysis, partially seen here, allowed Bivens to say of Aust, quote, "A number of the forms from his wheel are unique in this country, and today we are astounded at the quality of his ware in spite of the incredible output for which his shop was responsible." Stanley also addressed Rudolf Christ's 1786 to 1789 tenure at Bethabara, as well as looking at Christ's successor at Bethabara, Gottlob Kraus. Waster dumps in a cellar hole deposit led to interpretation of Christ's and Kraus's pottery production in Bethabara. The Bethabara waster dump material shown here contains fragments of a queensware plate, the fine pottery that Christ wanted to specialize in. And this signed mold from the Wachovia Historical Society collection clearly establishes that he had these plate forms in Bethabara. Stanley concluded his work at Bethabara, but other archaeologists have followed behind him there. Jackie Fahan and then John Clauser excavated the Gottlob Kraus kiln at Bethabara, later owned by John Butner, and Bethabara production continued into the 19th century as a location of Moravian pottery. Christ, who had a contentious relationship with Aust, both as an apprentice and then as a journeyman, had left Aust's shop in Salem in 1786 to establish himself as a master potter at Bethabara. After Aust's death in 1788, Christ returned to be the master potter in Salem. I had to rob this slide off of the internet, so I apologize for it. It was well known that a mysterious English visitor, a potter, who understood the production of queensware and had been a superintendent of a factory that made queensware, had spent a few days with Aust in 1771 explaining the process to the master potter. And we assume that Christ, then working in Aust's shop, also gained knowledge of the ware. Was this man John Bartlam, whose queensware pottery factory on the Wando River in South Carolina was found by Brad Rauschenberg. The records do not tell us. But 2 years later, in 1773, William Ellis, who had worked in the same shop as the mysterious potter of 1771, also appeared in Salem, catching a ride on Moravian wagons coming up from South Carolina. Ellis and Aust built an experimental kiln on Lot 49 beside the pottery shop in Salem on Lot 48, and Ellis taught Aust even more about production of the ware. And after Bethabara, Stand South was not done chasing the Moravian pottery story. Supported by interested local funders who were anonymous, South came to Salem following Gottfried Aust and Rudolf Christ. Stanley cut holes into Lot 49, the scene of pottery activity, adjacent to Lot 48. Excuse me. Held in private hands, the Lot 48 pottery shop has remained untouched archaeologically. But Lot 49 held some surprises and revelations. The remains of the 6 crushed faience ring bottles spoke to the production of that ware during Christ's term as master of the Salem pottery. And we saw Michelle demonstrate how you make one of those things. Christ had learned to make that ware from a visiting potter, German potter, Karl Eisenberg, in 1793. There was speculation about Rudolf Christ's production of queensware forms, and in the Salem Archaeology, it began to produce tantalizing information. Brad Rauschenberg, while excavating the first house location, found a mold designed to form the sprigged floral appliques on queensware hollowware. And at the fourth house location, South came down on a deposition of wasters. And in that deposit was a result that had been hoped for in the investigation of Lot 49, the remains of English-style fine pottery, fired to stoneware hardness. This spoke to the visit by the English potter William Ellis, who taught both Aust and Christ how to produce these wares. The English-style wares were the foundation for Christ's separation from Aust to become a master potter in his own right with the permission of the theocracy. However, these hard-fired English-style sprigged wares in particular are illustrative of a divergence of interpretation. Bivens associated these wares with the experimental kiln built on Lot 49 in 1773 by Aust and William Ellis to demonstrate the production of these forms. And Bivens believed that Ellis made the wares found in the waster deposit. South, on the other hand, interprets the artifacts as resulting from Christ's known production of stoneware in 1795, although it's not clear from the records what stoneware Christ produced, nor that he produced very much of it for any great length of time. The sprig mold with RC scribed on it, found by Brad Rauschenberg on the first house lot, lent weight to the argument that Christ produced such wares, but Bivens said, quote, "It has not yet been proven that Rudolf Christ undertook production of this kind of pottery to any extent." So, here are some unanswered questions, and it remains for us to seek some answers. Through archaeology on Lot 49, if permission is granted, on Lot 38 across the street, which Old Salem now owns, and which was the location of Christ's faience kilns. Archaeologist John Clauser recorded the mouth of a kiln on Lot 38 seen during the reconstruction of the Van Vleck house next door in 1976. We pinpointed the location of this kiln mouth with an excavation in 2007. However, we have been no further into the lot. There remains much to do on the pottery complex on Main Street, and many questions may be answered there. We've seen a lot about this. We also know from the inventories that Chris began to produce bottles in animal forms by 1800, and he and his successor, John Holland, who was apprenticed and journeyman under Christ, made these as well as press-molded toys. These animal bottle forms included squirrels, owls, foxes, chickens, ducks, dogs, doll heads, fish, sheep, turtles, and others. These forms are now known from the molds held in our collections that largely came from the Schaffner-Krauss pottery, and from examples of molded pottery purchased from individuals and from collections, and from the inventories made during the operation of the pottery shop as a congregation business. These pottery forms are typically assumed to have been produced by Rudolf Christ, or possibly by Holland. Bivens characteristically assigns these extant pieces to his middle period, 1774 to 1829. Rudolf Christ retired from the pottery shop in 1821, a man who had apprenticed under Gottfried Aust and who had then made a name for himself in his own right as the master potter of Salem. John Holland became the Salem master potter. But in 1829, by 1829, Holland's management of the pottery became so questionable in the mind of the Moravian leadership that operation of the pottery as a congregation business was ended. Following this date, Holland descended into disgrace and dissipation, according to the records. Although he was a potter, able to produce a piece of beauty, such as this one, or this writing set. In 1827, even while Holland continued as the Salem master potter, the theocratic leadership of Salem had begun to search for a skilled potter to replace him. And the Unity leadership in Europe recommended a Swiss Moravian potter who was working in Neuwied, Germany. This man was Heinrich Schaffner. Schaffner considered the offer but did not come to America and to Salem until November 1833. He entered Holland's shop for a brief period of time, and very quickly by April 1834, Schaffner notified Salem governing boards, quote, that for several good reasons he was minded to sever his present connection with John Holland, wishing to set one up of his own, unquote. The Alsacer Collegium agreed, commenting, "We regretted that he could not take over the pottery altogether in Holland's place. The latter shows little zeal in carrying it on." And so the Moravian potter, Heinrich Schaffner, was brought here to be the potter, a man who was trained in Germany and was not part of the line from Aust through Christ. And he was only involved with Holland long enough to know that he wanted nothing to do with that. Schaffner set up his operation in the builder's house, the first building erected in Salem in 1834, and began potting. The Salem leadership allowed him the use of a number of tools he requested, quote, that now lie unused at Holland's: a glazier's mill, a potter's wheel. By June 6, 1834, and by that date, he had dug his first clay. 8 days later, by June 14, 1834, he had become Henry Schaffner of Salem, North Carolina, and had thrown this cream pot. This vessel requires some thought. First, it still exists. It was recently given to Old Salem by descendant members of the Schaffner family, and it had been cared for over those long years. In form, it is nearly indistinguishable from cream pots thrown by Aust or Christ, barring the small details that are evidence of an individual potter's hand. Unlike other cream pots, however, it is completely glazed on the interior, as would be expected, but also on the entirety of its exterior, which is not normally done. The glaze is a rich, deep brown, glowing. And unlike other cream pots, utilitarian earthenware, this vessel is scribed in plain view, quote, Henry Schaffner in Salem, North Carolina, Stokes County, June 14th, 1834. This object is a statement that says, here I am. We would assume from this vessel that Schaffner was going to be a potter of utilitarian earthenware and that that's what he was able to do. We thought this to a certain extent when on digging on the Herp site in a cellar hole deposit dating from 1829 and sealed in 1860, where we encountered a large array of kitchenware, lead-glazed utilitarian earthenware. And so I said, let's go to the pottery where this must have come from, Schaffner's pottery on Lot 81, and see what we can learn about his production of these utilitarian wares. We had documentary information about the layout of the pottery during the 1880s, shortly after Heinrich Schaffner had died and Daniel Krauss had become the master potter on the site. The Sanborn insurance map from 1885 identifies the elements of the pottery complex, as well as the house Schaffner built after his original house burned in 1864. This photograph, taken between 1864 and 1874, shows the shop complex looking toward the southeast, and in it we can also see the warehouse. And by combining a tracing of the photo taken prior to 1874 that shows the complex with a comparison to the Sanborn map, we gain a good understanding of the layout of the complex, which is refined in some detail in this relatively famous photograph from 1882, showing the relationship between the shop right there, the kiln, which is right here, which butted up against the dry house, which you can see a piece of right here. Our first goal in the first season was to locate this kiln, thinking that it would be one of the most durable features of the pottery. And after punching through 5 feet of sterile fill deposited by NCDOT, thank you very much, NCDOT, in 1956 to 1958, during the construction of Old Salem Road, we exposed the east wall of the kiln. We just got it with a backhoe, but we got it. And although this glimpse demonstrated the archaeological presence of kiln structure, it was an incomplete look. And in successive excavations, we further exposed the kiln, including the firebox where this excavator is working. We also know from further excavation that the firebox on the left in this photograph extended into the dry house at the north end of the kiln. We believe that the kiln was loaded from the south end to the right. There is no evidence in this kiln of the production of anything but lead-glazed earthenware. No evidence of salt glazing. A view that is confirmed in the pottery scene here. You will also notice that a portion of the west wall is gone. We think we can also thank NCDOT for that. Here the crew is standing inside the shop ruin, looking at the north wall. Just against the inside of that wall, we recovered 2 potter's ribs lying together that fell from a bench that we think was right against the north window. Just outside the wall, we recovered the round stamp mold made from fired clay and a scribing tool made from a bone-handled toothbrush. During the excavation, we recovered a substantial amount of pottery as well. The value of archaeological excavation, the value of the archaeological context is that it has the ability to correct us in our misapprehensions. Schaffner himself said what he was about when he spoke to the Salem leadership about setting up his own operation. He believes that he would not hurt Brother Holland's pottery by this, since he wishes to manufacture only small and fancy articles, which Holland cannot make. Much sympathy was expressed for him and readiness to meet his wishes. He had said in 1827, during his first negotiations with the leaders of Salem, that he was skilled in working with molds. We have known that he made some of the majestic moldware tile stoves of Wachovia, a product that begins here with Aust and which Schaffner was obviously skilled at. Evidence of these stove tiles, as in the orange tile fragment that you see here, is found in the ground at the pottery shop. I'm glad you got a little look at that ahead of time. Yes, he made utilitarian earthenware. But early on in our excavations on the Schaffner pottery site, we were startled by finding this sherd of a feather-edged plate in bisque. This, of course, is the same kind of ware, the fine pottery, that Rudolf Christ had made earlier. This small sherd, about the size of my thumbnail, indicated that Schaffner had also possibly made this ware. As work continued, more of these tight sherds emerged, indicating more than one mold being used and more than one form. Here we see feather-edge plate forms and also a sherd and royal pattern. These sherds were in bisque, obviously being made from molds that Schaffner had, and to relieve any doubt about who was making this ware, Schaffner applied his very clear stamp to the base of one of these plates. As an aside, for those of you who are collectors, there may be finished plates out there somewhere, stamped with Schaffner's HS, and I sure would like to see one at some point. Schaffner had the plate molds. Well, as we think about it, we knew that. But our view of these wares has been skewed by thinking that any such ware as this from here must have been made by Christ. And what else was Schaffner producing? What other molds did he have? Well, he was producing the animal bottles. Here on the right, lower right, is the base for a bird form bottle in bisque found on the Schaffner Krause pottery site. It is shown here with an owl form made by Michelle Erickson in our archaeology lab. The upper part of her owl was formed in the original mold that, according to Bivens, came into the Wachovia Historical Society collection from the Schaffner Krause pottery in 1900. Schaffner had the owl bottle mold, or molds, as well as other forms. Here is a squirrel paw in bisque found at the Schaffner Krause pottery, compared to a squirrel bottle from Old Salem collections, and also shown with the mold for this part of the bottle. Here's a glazed bird from the Schaffner Krause pottery compared to a molded bowl from the collections. The orange sherd in this slide is a fragment of a fish bottle in bisque found at the Schaffner Krause pottery. Here on the right is the head of a figure in bisque found at Schaffner-Krauss pottery. And although a colleague has said this is a sheep head, I prefer not to identify it so firmly and leave it open to speculation as to what it is. I do note that the shape of the mouth has a close resemblance to the bear's mouth in this bottle from collections. But this is a solid thing, and so listening to Michelle talk about the creation of master forms, I wonder about that here. This fragment of a twisted rope motif from a decorative lion's head applique found at the Schaffner-Krauss pottery is also shown with the mold from the collection. Potter's tools that are held by the Wachovia Historical Society are found to have a close fit to pottery ware produced by Schaffner, such as on these signed pieces, shown with a rib from the collection that so closely fits this teacup. Below are waster sherds of wheel-thrown plates from the Schaffner-Krauss pottery excavation. And here, this is a wheel-thrown fine hollowware vessel lid with sprig-molded floral appliques. You will recall that this is the kind of ware that Stan South and John Bivens entered into debate about, the ware that was found in stoneware on Lot 49, except that this is an earthenware bisque, and it is from the Schaffner-Krauss pottery and dates after 1834. This and the other fragments we have just seen tell us that there was far more going on in the Schaffner pottery than utilitarian earthenware. And these fragments clearly tell us that not all fine English pottery produced here, not all animal bottles produced here, were produced by Rudolf Christ. And given the debate between Bivens and South about the origin of the sprig-molded ware on Lot 49, this sherd, shown here from the Schaffner-Krauss pottery, may be the clearest evidence of fine hollowware with floral appliques produced by a Moravian potter that we have. I've barely mentioned trail slipware in this talk, and you will have seen a great deal of it by the end of this symposium. Before John Bivens died, I asked him when he thought the manufacture of trailed slipware Moravian pottery ended. He said then, and I thought it also, that probably 1830 was about it. Here again, the archaeology of the Lot 81 pottery shop cautions us to be careful, since we have recovered a number of sherds that are fragments, and this is a sample, of trailed slipware. Of course, since this is a Moravian house site that has the earliest occupation in Salem, we would expect trailed slipware to show up. But as we examine this group, a number of sherds are in bisque and have not been through the gloss firing. Sherds that were in the process of the manufacture of this pottery. They are trailed slip decorated ware that was manufactured after 1834 here in Salem. And not to neglect utilitarian earthenware, which, it should be emphasized, continued as lead-glazed earthenware through the 19th century. Here are two cook pots from the pottery site and one from the Herbst lot, the excavation that originally led us to explore the Schaffner-Krauss pottery site. All three are the same pot, basically. But the cook pot from Herbst has one handle, and the two from the Schaffner-Krauss pottery shop, one has two handles, and one has two handles and three legs. The flat bottom is for cooking on a flat top range. But the three-legged pot tells us that there was still someone here who was cooking on the coals on a hearth after 1834. And it tells us as well that the potter was prepared to accommodate that customer. As all Moravian potters did, Schaffner produced stub stem pipes. This one a Turk's head with Schaffner's HS mark. And the Schaffner Krause Pottery Shop produced apothecary jars, pie plates, flower pots. Heinrich Schaffner died in 1877. He came here in 1833 as a skilled potter trained in the Moravian Pottery Shop in Neuwied, Germany. By the time he established his shop, the pottery was not a congregation business here, although the Moravian leadership had a great interest in its operation and its success. As a result, his production did not have the kind of record keeping that has produced a kind of invisibility for Schaffner, his products, and his shop, in the scholarship of the Moravian pottery tradition. In fact, one scholar of North Carolina pottery commented that with Schaffner's predecessor, John Holland's improvidence, quote, the dissolution of the Moravian ethnic community brought to an early end one of the most remarkable ceramic traditions in the United States, unquote. Well, that comment can be challenged on both levels. The Moravian ethnic community certainly underwent great change through the 19th century, but substantial argument can be made that these changes were transitional rather than dissolution. And from what we have seen at the Schaffner pottery site, it is a rush to judgment to say that Moravian pottery declined in both quality and quantity. It is not at all clear that that's the case, and it should be noted that we have yet to actually get into a waster dump there to see the full array of the products from that operation. The archaeological context. If you want to know what was going on, and I've learned this the hard way as a professional archaeologist, if you want your assumptions challenged, if you want to work toward understanding, one good way to do it is to get into the ground. Daniel Krause, who had entered the shop as an apprentice in 1846, became the master potter of Salem at Schaffner's death in 1877. Krause was born in Louisville and worked in Schaffner's shop from age 11 with time out as a soldier in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. He was known for producing thousands of the stub-stem Moravian tobacco pipes at the pottery. And among the molds that Schaffner and then Krause were using were many 19th century forms as well as several forms that are closely identical to pipes that Aust first made at Bethabara in 1755. Here in this well-known photograph of the Krause operation at the pottery shop in 1882, we see jardinières, flower pots, cooking vessels awaiting loading into the kiln. There is also a potter, likely a journeyman, loading a sagger with pipes from the nearly 1,200 greenware pipes in the trays on the trestles. Note the stacks of saggers behind him against the kiln wall. It's no surprise that we have found thousands of saggers and many pipes from the variety of molds at the Schaffner Krause pottery. With this look inside the shop during Krause's tenure, there's a glimpse of something going on besides pipes. Although a pipe press is visible on the bench, we see several sizes of jugs, there are bowls, pans, number of crocks, and we wonder. Daniel Krause gave much of his equipment to the Wachovia Historical Society sometime around 1900, according to John Bivens, indicating an awareness of a legacy that was ending. You can see a display of that shop and tools upstairs in the art and clay exhibit. Krause died in 1903, and most will say so went the last master potter in Salem, except. And I have found that in history, except is a handy word. His daughter Augusta, who trained and worked in the pottery from the time she was a small girl, ran it for a little longer than 2 more years. And she said in an interview in 1963, when this photograph was taken, that she ended it because she could not find any help. This is a photograph of the shop as it was being pulled down in 1907. I call your attention to the tree against the wall of this shop. This is a photograph of the same shop seen archaeologically. Here's a portion of the north foundation, and here is the tree. Now we know the tree was standing when the shop was being demolished, but when we saw it, it was full of pottery, tools, clay, and other material from the shop. It had been filled immediately during the demolition of the shop, which meant that the tree had been cut, the stump pulled out of the ground, probably with a team, and the hole packed with material out of the building as it was being taken apart. This stump hole became a little box of things from Krause's shop. And down in the box was this earthenware porringer in a red paste, covered in a white slip and awaiting its gloss firing. I think this is Krause at the end of the time in the pottery. I've got more, but the time is late. So I think this is a good place to stop. And I will just merely add that there's a lot more to know than we know right now. Thank you very much.